Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History. Today we're going to kind of highlight the continued conversation over Reconstruction, and we'll get into some of the events that happened, and we'll continue looking at Andrew Johnson's presidency, and then, of course, we're going to look at the gentleman here on our screen, President Grant, and what is sort of the beginning of his presidency with more of a radical look at Reconstruction. So, in particular today, one of our big ideas is the rights of African Americans in Reconstruction. And kind of our learning target for today is we're going to identify why, once Northerners are starting to realize that African Americans in the South are being mistreated and are having violence conducted against them, how they can work towards finding a way to help them. And so we'll highlight like the 14th and the 15th Amendment, and we'll talk about the steps as far as bringing the African Americans into society post-Civil War, how particularly Republicans in the North go about trying to look at that. So we certainly, and we'll get into the treatment here a little bit more of African Americans, but what you guys will see is that there's violence certainly being conducted against African Americans throughout southern states, and in particular in Memphis. The violence in Memphis really convinces radical Republicans that Johnson's Reconstruction plan is just not strong enough. And so to kind of highlight some of the issues certainly that are here, many southern states began to pass what are called black codes, which are a series of laws in the South just after the Civil War that really aimed to control free men, newly freed slaves, enable plantation owners in particular to exploit African American workers. And we'll get into towards the end of today, and that phenomenon is really highlighted by sharecropping. And so with these black codes being put in place to try to control African American populations, I want to show you guys an example of this. So certainly this quote contains language that today would be inappropriate, but looking at the time period, this is the wording that you would have seen. So certainly bear that in mind. So it says, no free men shall be allowed to rent or keep a house within the limits of the town under any circumstances. And so what you're seeing specifically with this one is, and what you would see in other examples of the black codes, is you're trying, and what these laws are trying to do is they're trying to put down African Americans from taking more equality and taking more of a step forward. It's trying to suppress them by limiting their opportunities. And so in this case, living in town, that would limit your economic situation and the ability to perhaps own more equity in your home in town. And so it's even trying to segregate the populations where African Americans would live in the country and outside of town, and their white counterparts would live within town. So it's, again, even just a physical segregation. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1866, which is going to grant full citizenship to African Americans. And essentially it gave the federal government the right to intervene in state affairs in order to protect their rights. And so the federal government could step in and change things as necessary in order to ensure equal opportunity and equal citizenship for African Americans, regardless of what the state law says. President Johnson vetoed this bill. He thought it was too radical, but Republicans in Congress had enough votes to override him. And remember, that means to overturn or to defeat a veto. And remember that takes 2/3 of the Congress in order to do that. So they were able to override his veto. This just kind of begins to highlight the tough relationship and Johnson's inability to work with Congress in this time period. This is just another good example of that. And then you have the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment grants full citizenship to anybody who was born in the United States. And essentially it says that no state can take away a citizen's life, liberty, and property, going all the way back to John Locke and some of the fundamentals of the ideas that gave birth to the United States, without due process of the law. And so it provides equal protection for anybody who was born in the United States under the Constitution, regardless of who you are. So just to kind of give you more specific language, it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, so born in the U.S. or are subject to the, essentially the control of the United States, are citizens of the U.S. and of the state wherein they reside. So they are both citizens of the state and of the country. And no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge, try to take away, the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without due process of the law. So essentially, all those rights that are in the Bill of Rights, that are in the Constitution, they are for everybody, regardless of who you are. Nor deny any person within its jurisdictions the equal protection of the laws. So everybody should be seen as equal under the law, under, again, the 14th Amendment. Another kind of shift in main idea here. We're going to talk about how radical Republicans essentially are kind of going to be able to put their version of Reconstruction into action. And you're going to see this later on with the presidential election with Grant, but you're also going to see it in how they deal with Johnson before that time period. So Congress passed a series of laws during this time period of more radical Reconstruction because, remember, they're able to override the presidential veto. And so the first Reconstruction Act essentially set up military commanders for 10 southern states until new state governments were created. So essentially you've got these military districts in which the military is in charge of enforcing these new laws and ensuring that everybody within the state is following them. The second Reconstruction Act then requires those commanders to register voters and prepare for state constitutional conventions. So essentially the military is now in charge of helping to set up these new states and help them to reconstruct their governments and also, of course, their constitutional conventions, rewriting perhaps in some cases their constitution. Because, of course, those needed to be changed after the Civil War because many of them changed it to join the Confederate States of America. They also passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, what that law said is that the president couldn't remove government officials without the Senate's approval. This, again, just goes further to tell you a little bit about the relationship or the lack of relationship that Johnson has with Congress. Now, Johnson is a little stubborn, and in 1867, Johnson suspends and then removes his Secretary of War, which would be Edwin Stanton, without the Senate's approval. He's kind of daring Congress to make a move here. And the House sees this, and they put him on trial. They impeach him. And so that means to formally charge a public official with misconduct in office. And certainly when this is being recorded in 2021, we've seen recently the second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump. And so certainly connections to even more recent history today. Johnson, however, it moves, of course, the House is the one who brings charges, and then it goes to the Senate for trial. Senate failed to achieve the 2/3 majority that they needed to convict him, and so Johnson was able to finish the rest of his term. However, in the election of 1868, we're going to have a new president, Ulysses S. Grant, again, former Union general. He's going to be serving as president again starting in 1868. And he showed voters that there was more support for the Republican approach to Reconstruction moving forward. And so the next big amendment on our list is the 15th Amendment. This was ratified in 1870, again under President Grant. And you're going to see that it prohibited state and federal governments from essentially denying the right to vote to any male citizen. Remember, we're not going to have women's right to vote until the 19th Amendment in 1920. We're getting there, I promise. But any male citizen, regardless of their race, their color, their previous condition of servitude, now had the right to vote, and that could not be taken away from them. What you are going to see later on after Reconstruction is that there are going to be barriers put up to this. And so We'll get into those a little bit here, but you guys will see that even though that law is there are barriers put in place, and many of those aren't taken away until the middle of the 1960s. So Reconstruction again ends, and the true freedom of African Americans now becomes a distant dream, and these ideas of reenfranchising African Americans are going to be lost for quite some time after Reconstruction ends. So Southern leaders, they found ways to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote. They put up barriers. So many Southern states began to require a poll tax, which means that when you went to the poll, you had to pay a tax in order to be able to vote. And so if you are an African American who is struggling just to get by and find your way, and you've got the choice between that or paying for something else that you need, you're going to pay for that something else that you need instead of the opportunity to vote. You also began to see literacy taxes being put in place for some voters, and so that required that a voter needed to be able to read and write at a specific level. Again, if you're being denied the opportunity for education, that would put you at a disadvantage here, that you wouldn't be able to meet the requirement to vote. You also, in some states, have something called the grandfather clause, which basically allowed white voters who couldn't read and write, if their fathers and grandfathers had voted, they could now vote. And so you're starting to see segregation, again, that separation or isolation of, in this case, an ethnic group or a race, and then your class or your group. And so you're going to continue to see African Americans being, in some cases physically, like in that black code that we showed you, or economically, or in other ways, from their white counterparts throughout the country. And so these began to become what we call Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow sets back a lot of progress for African Americans until about the 1960s. So Jim Crow was a character in a traveling minstrel show, and the connection there is connected to that place that some white Southerners wanted African Americans to be in. This gets reinforced later by the Supreme Court, because in 1896, so we're fast forwarding a little bit here, the Supreme Court essentially is going to upheld segregation in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which they basically rule that separation of these two groups of people, African Americans and their white counterparts, is constitutional as long as it is equal. As long as there are equal facilities for both, there is, of course, can be segregation. This includes schools and public places, but you're going to see very quickly that they're not equal, and they really never are equal. And so you're going to continue to see acts of violence. You're going to see the rise of radical groups like the White League and the Ku Klux Klan, and you're going to see violence, including lynching, take place during this time period. Whoops, my apologies. So lynching, of course, is putting a person to death by basically an illegal action of a mob. And so this was increasingly being targeted against African Americans, encouraging them not to vote, encouraging them to live in fear. So what enabled illiterate whites to vote while excluding illiterate African Americans? Was it the grandfather clauses, the Jim Crow laws, the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, or poll taxes? So take a moment if you need to, pause the video, think about it. But our best answer here is grandfather clauses. So again, you are going to see, kind of coming back to the 15th Amendment, you are going to see that African American men are going to have the right to vote, but you are going to see those obstacles put into place. So the other institution that you see that's going to set back African Americans is sharecropping. And this is basically a system of farming in which a farmer or a landowner would rent out land, and then, of course, provide equipment and seeds and other things that needed to be shared or rented in order for people to work the land. And so this became a commonplace, but it made it very difficult because African Americans didn't own the land, and landowners could continue to raise the rent while prices didn't match that increase. And so it increasingly put African Americans into debt. And in many ways, sharecropping was very little better than slavery. And it was a way of ensuring that African Americans could not gain the economic benefit of their freedom. And so that's where we're going to wrap up today, ladies and gentlemen. So a lot of obstacles put in place towards African Americans at this time period. For my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes. For those of you listening, I really appreciate your learning, and I hope that in some ways we're helping you to better kind of understand some of the themes that you'll see throughout history, especially in regards to African Americans. But thank you for listening, everyone, and have a great day.